They're massive. Move out, stay alert.
Copy that. Advancing now.
Deader now. Hold your fire until I say so.
In late April of 2019, during a tense period of heightened military alert along the Indian-Nepalese border, a specialized Indian Army mountaineering unit was conducting a high-altitude reconnaissance and training mission deep within the Himalayan range, operating under conditions that blended extreme weather with the ever-present awareness of wartime readiness. When an unexpected discovery disrupted their disciplined routine and shifted their focus from strategy and survival to something far older and far more unsettling. As near their temporary snowbound campsite, the soldiers encounter a line of massive footprints embedded deeply into untouched snow, each print astonishingly large, unnaturally symmetrical, and spaced with deliberate precision, suggesting not the chaotic movement of an animal, but the steady gait of something walking upright with intent. And while such a discovery might have been dismissed as illusion by untrained eyes, these men were combat-hardened professionals, accustomed to reading terrain, tracking movement, and identifying threats, and they immediately recognized that these tracks did not belong to any known wildlife native to the region, nor could they be explained by equipment, hoaxes, or environmental distortion. And as images of the footprints were later released to the public, much of the global media reacted with ridicule and skepticism, reducing the incident to superstition or misidentification, yet within military circles and among veterans mountaineers, the discovery resonated deeply, because this was far from the first time soldiers operating in the high mountains of Asia had reported encountering something that defied explanation. And for centuries, long before modern borders, radar systems, or satellite imagery, local villagers, traveling monks, and armed patrols had whispered of a towering presence that appeared in the most remote and hostile passes, a being that seemed to observe human movement silently before vanishing into fog and snow. And the Indian Army's discovery became not an isolated event, but the latest chapter in a long and troubling pattern of encounters that stretched back through colonial expeditions, wartime patrols, and early reconnaissance missions where men returned shaken, confused, or unwilling to speak openly about what they had seen. And to understand the weight of this discovery, one must return to the early Cold War years, when a respected British military attaché and mountaineer named Eric Shipton made a similar find during a 1951 Everest reconnaissance expedition. A man whose reputation for rational thought and scientific discipline made his account impossible to dismiss. Because Shipton, like the Indian soldiers decades later, had no interest in myths, only in terrain, logistics, and survival. Yet even he found himself forced to confront evidence that challenged established knowledge. And as history has shown repeatedly, when soldiers, men trained to suppress fear and rely on observation, report the same phenomenon across different eras, nations, and conflicts, the explanation may lie not in imagination, but in something humanity has yet to fully understand, something that has learned to survive by remaining unseen while wars rise and fall beneath the silent watch of the mountains. 6 years after the Second World War had finally loosened its grip on Europe, Eric Shipton, a former British military attaché, known for his calm judgment and analytical discipline, returned fully to the mountains that had shaped his youth. And in 1951, he was selected to lead the British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition, a mission that carried strategic importance as much as scientific curiosity in an era when nations still viewed unexplored territory through a wartime lens. And as Shipton and his team moved cautiously across the Menlung Glacier near the Tibetan border, navigating crevasses with the precision of soldiers advancing through hostile ground. They encountered something that instantly disrupted their sense of order and reason, because stretching across the frozen expanse before them was a clear line of enormous footprints pressed deep into the snow, unbroken, purposeful, and astonishingly large. And unlike marks left by animals scrambling or sliding, these impressions showed balance, rhythm, and intention, as if whatever made them walked upright and confidently through one of the most dangerous landscapes on Earth. And Shipton, aware that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, immediately ordered photographs to be taken, carefully placing an ice axe beside the prints to establish scale. And when developed, the images revealed footprints measuring nearly 18 inches long and over a foot wide, with broad rounded toes unlike those of bears, wolves, or any known Himalayan wildlife. And what disturbed Shipton most was the anatomical detail, because the structure of the foot suggested a bipedal creature adapted to gripping ice and leaping crevasses, something that moved not on instinct alone, but with experience and physical intelligence. And despite pressure to dismiss the find, Shipton could not reconcile the tracks with any conventional explanation. And when he consulted the Sherpa guides accompanying the expedition, men who had survived avalanches, starvation, and decades of dangerous labor in the high mountains, they answered without hesitation, telling him the tracks belonged to the Yeti, a being they spoke of not as a fairy tale, but as a real and elusive presence. And one Sherpa in particular, Tenzing, quietly recounted an encounter from 2 years earlier when he had seen such a creature at a distance of only 25 yards, describing it as a towering half-man, half-beast form covered in reddish brown hair, standing silently before retreating into the mist. And unlike sensational stories meant to inspire fear, Tenzing's account carried a tone of respect and caution, suggesting the creature avoided humans rather than hunted them. And when Shipton's photographs reached Britain, they ignited worldwide controversy, because for many they represented the first credible visual evidence that the Yeti might be more than legend, while for scientific institutions like the British Museum, they posed an uncomfortable challenge, prompting officials to quickly attribute the tracks to Himalayan langurs or misidentified bears. Yet these explanations failed under scrutiny, as langurs walked primarily on all fours and bore feet, with long, narrow toes, entirely inconsistent with the rounded impressions in Shipton's images. And bears, while capable of leaving large prints, lacked the symmetry and stride pattern of the photographed tracks. And as debate intensified, Shipton himself remained measured, refusing to label the creature, but firmly rejecting false explanations. And what made his testimony especially powerful was not belief, but restraint, because as a veteran of war and exploration, he understood how easily fear and imagination could deceive men under stress. Yet he also knew when evidence demanded honesty, and his conclusion was simple and unsettling, that something unknown, upright, and powerful moved through the high Himalayas, and that it had done so long before modern expeditions or armies ever arrived. And in the aftermath of global conflict, when humanity believed it was finally mastering the Earth, Shipton's discovery suggested instead that there were still forces and beings shaped by an older world, watching silently as soldiers and explorers crossed their frozen domain. As the controversy surrounding Eric Shipton's photographs spread through scientific and military circles, a deeper and far more unsettling theory began to take shape. One that suggested the Yeti was not a myth born of fear or folklore, but a biological survivor from a prehistoric age. And among the few scholars willing to explore this idea was Dutch zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans, a man unafraid of professional ridicule, who carefully compared decades of soldier testimonies, mountaineer reports, and footprint evidence with fossil discoveries made during the turbulent years between global conflicts. And his attention focused on an ancient creature known as Gigantopithecus, a massive ape species identified primarily through enormous fossilized teeth discovered in Chinese apothecaries during the 1930s, teeth that were sold as medicinal curiosities during a time when Asia itself was fractured by invasion, war, and political upheaval. and these teeth some twice the size of gorillas. Molars suggested a creature that may have stood 10 to 12 feet tall, possessing immense strength and a body capable of upright locomotion. And while mainstream science declared Gigantopithecus extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago, Uvelmans found impossible to ignore how closely eyewitness descriptions of the Yeti matched later artistic reconstructions of this ancient giant, particularly those accounts given by soldiers and prisoners of war whose testimonies emerged not from imagination but from survival under extreme conditions. And one of the most striking of these came from Polish Army officer Sławomir Rawicz, who in 1941 escaped from a Soviet prisoner of war camp in Siberia and later described observing enormous hair-covered beings while crossing remote mountain terrain, creatures that walked upright on two legs, moved calmly in small groups, and appeared neither startled nor aggressive toward human presence. And Rawitz's account described sloping shoulders, long arms reaching nearly to the knees, and a powerful chest, with faces difficult to discern but bodies covered in long, loose hair of a rusty camel color. And what made this testimony particularly disturbing was that Rawicz had no prior knowledge of Gigantopithecus or any Western theories about ancient apes, yet his description aligned almost perfectly with scientific models developed years later. And this convergence of independent observation and fossil-based reconstruction raised a chilling possibility that what soldiers and explorers have been encountering for centuries was not a supernatural being, but a remnant population of a once dominant hominid species, driven into isolation by human expansion, warfare, and competition for resources, and history provided precedent for such survival. Because numerous species long believed extinct had later been rediscovered in regions destabilized by war or rendered inaccessible by extreme geography, and the Himalayas, scarred by centuries of military movement, imperial ambition, and territorial conflict, offered vast stretches of wilderness where a highly intelligent and physically powerful species could avoid detection, particularly if it had learned through generations that humans brought violence, disease, and destruction wherever they settled. And it was no coincidence, Uvelmans argued, that many Yeti sightings occurred during periods of heightened human conflict, when armies pushed deeper into remote terrain, disturbing ecosystems that had remained undisturbed for millennia, forcing encounters that would otherwise never occur. And if Gigantopithecus or related bipedal species had survived into modern times, it would have done so not by dominating its environment, but by retreating from it, becoming a shadow presence that watched from ridgelines and forests, retreating silently at the sound of gunfire or human voices. And this idea reframed the Yeti not as a monster, but as a casualty of humanity's ancient and ongoing wars, a survivor that learned the ultimate lesson of conflict, that survival belongs not to the strongest or the boldest, but to those who remain unseen. And as this theory gained quiet traction among a handful of researchers, it threatened to blur the line between legend and history, suggesting that the Himalayas were not merely the site of human struggle and military ambition, but a refuge for something far older, something that had endured every war by refusing to fight at all. By the mid-1950s, as the world settled uneasily into the Cold War and military intelligence agencies quietly mapped even the most remote regions of the globe, the search for the Yeti took on a new and more complicated character, because expeditions into the Himalayas were no longer driven solely by curiosity or adventure, but increasingly intertwined with strategic interests. And while many teams returned without ever glimpsing a living creature, they uncovered something that proved just as disturbing: a series of strange relics preserved in isolated Tibetan and Nepalese monasteries. Artifacts spoken of in hushed tones by monks who regarded them not as curiosities, but as sacred objects bound to ancient warnings. And among these were conical scalps covered in coarse, weathered hair, elongated in shape with a pronounced crest running down the center. Objects that local communities believed belonged to the Yeti and were treated with reverence born of fear and respect. And when journalists and Western explorers finally gained access to these relics, skepticism quickly followed, because early examinations revealed that some scalps were stitched together from the hides of local animals, a discovery that allowed critics to dismiss the entire phenomenon as deception or religious misunderstanding. Yet this conclusion proved dangerously simplistic, because not all artifacts fit such easy explanations, and one in particular, kept at the Pangbosh Monastery in Nepal, would haunt researchers for decades. A skeletal hand said to belong to a yeti, complete with finger bones, fragments of skin, and an unsettling resemblance to a human hand distorted by size and proportion. And during a 1957 expedition funded by American adventurer Thomas Slick, parts of this relic were secretly removed from the monastery under circumstances that remain disputed to this day, with some accounts claiming theft and others insisting the monks agreed in exchange for financial support. But regardless of how the bones were obtained, their journey out of the Himalayas resembled a covert wartime operation rather than a scientific transfer, involving smuggling across borders, deception of customs officials, and even the unlikely assistance of Hollywood actor Jimmy Stewart and his wife, who concealed the bones among personal belongings to evade inspection. And once in the West, the Pangbosh hand became the subject of repeated testing, and unlike the scalps, it resisted simple classification because early analyses could not conclusively identify the bones as belonging to any known animal species, nor could they easily dismiss them as entirely human, leaving the artifact suspended in an uncomfortable gray zone that fueled speculation and frustration in equal measure. And for years the hand circulated through laboratories and private collections, symbolizing the fragile line between discovery and exploitation, until advances in DNA testing decades later suggested that at least one finger bone was human, a finding that skeptics seized upon as final proof of fraud. Yet this revelation raised more questions than it answered, because it implied either the deliberate construction of a composite relic using human remains or the presence of ritual practices that science had yet to understand, and before further testing could resolve the mystery. The remaining parts of the Pangbosh hand were stolen from the monastery under unexplained circumstances, vanishing into private hands and forever removing the possibility of definitive analysis. And this disappearance echoed a familiar wartime pattern, where inconvenient evidence is lost, destroyed, or buried to preserve comfortable narratives. And in the aftermath, skeptics declared victory, while believers were left with absence instead of proof. But absence itself can be telling, because in regions shaped by secrecy, conflict, and power, truth is often not disproven. It is simply made inaccessible, and the relics of the Himalayas, half exposed and half erased, suggested that the story of the Yeti was being shaped not only by nature and time, but by human interference, fear, and the quiet decisions made in the shadows. As the decades following the Second World War unfolded, reports of Yeti encounters did not fade as skeptics had predicted, but instead followed the expanding footprint of human exploration and military movement into some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. And it was during this period that soldiers, pilots, and climbers, men accustomed to danger and disciplined observation, continued to report sightings and evidence that defied conventional explanation, beginning with British Royal Air. 4 Squadron Leader Lester Davies, a decorated wartime pilot who had flown combat missions over Southeast Asia before turning his skills toward mountain rescue and high-altitude exploration. And in the mid-1950s, while operating in the Himalayas, Davies was awakened before dawn by Sherpas urging him to examine a fresh trail of footprints that cut cleanly through the snow near their camp, each print measuring nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, pressed deeply as though made by a creature of immense weight. And unlike previous discoveries, these tracks did something extraordinary, because they led directly into an icy river, crossed it without hesitation, and emerged intact on the opposite bank. And Davies, standing chest deep in freezing water as he followed the trail, realized with growing unease that whatever had crossed before him had done so upright and without struggle, suggesting a height and strength far exceeding that of any known animal, and based on stride, length, and depth of impression. He estimated the creature to be over 8 feet tall and weighing close to 900 pounds. Conclusions he documented meticulously through hundreds of photographs later sent to the British Museum, where, like so much evidence before them, they were archived without explanation, and similar encounters continue to surface, including those funded by American oilman and adventurer Thomas Slick Jr., who in 1957 organized multiple expeditions into Nepal driven by a genuine belief that the Yeti represented an undiscovered hominid species. And although Slick's teams gathered hair samples, excrement, eyewitness testimony, and repeated reports of massive tracks, direct contact with the creature remained elusive, as though its sense pursuit long before humans realized they were close. And during one expedition, Slick himself was injured, forcing him to withdraw while continuing to fund the search through hired explorers and despite deploying train tracking hounds capable of following the faintest scent. The teams repeatedly lost the trail in terrain that offered no natural explanation for such disappearances, reinforcing the impression that the Yeti possessed not only physical power, but situational awareness, and perhaps intelligence comparable to early humans. And the most unsettling encounters of this era were not visual, but auditory, because climbers and soldiers alike described deep, resonant bellows echoing across snowfields at night, sounds that carried intent rather than randomness, freezing even experienced men in place. And in 1970, while climbing Annapurna, British mountaineer Don Willens witnessed 2 lines of crows erupt into the sky in sudden panic at dusk, an event his Sherpas attributed without hesitation to the presence of a Yeti. And though darkness prevented pursuit, Willens discovered massive tracks the following morning that descended from higher elevations before vanishing over a ridge, and later that night, under pale moonlight, he observed a dark ape-like figure bounding uphill with disturbing speed, its movement purposeful and predatory, creating an oppressive sense of dread that lingered until the figure disappeared, at which point the atmosphere itself seemed to lift. And such experiences echoed the psychological impact of warfare, where unseen enemies exert control not through direct engagement, but through presence alone. And as these accounts accumulated across continents and decades, they painted a picture not of a random beast, but of a being that existed at the margins of human conflict, appearing where isolation, danger, and silence reigned, leaving behind only tracks and unanswered questions before retreating once more into shadow. While Western explorers debated the existence of the Yeti through photographs and relics, an entirely separate and far more secretive body of evidence was quietly developing behind the Iron Curtain, where Soviet scientists and military personnel operating in the remote mountain ranges of Central Asia reported encounters with a similar being known locally as the Alma. And unlike sensational Western media accounts, these reports were documented in a restrained, almost clinical tone shaped by a culture that valued discipline and discouraged fantasy, making them all the more unsettling. And in January of 1958, one of the most compelling observations was recorded by Dr. Alexander Pronin of Leningrad University, a former MiG-3 fighter pilot and decorated Soviet squadron commander, who, 13 years after the end of the Second World War, was conducting hydrological research in a mountainous region of Central Asia as part of a government-funded scientific mission. And while surveying a snow-covered slope near a cliff edge, Pronin noticed a figure standing motionless against the sky, which he initially assumed to be a bear until he focused more carefully and realized that the shape before him was unmistakably man-like, standing upright with legs spread apart for balance, arms hanging lower than those of a normal human, and a body covered in reddish-gray hair that moved slightly in the wind. And for more than 5 minutes, he observed the figure without interference, noting its posture, proportions, and calm demeanor before it slowly retreated behind a rocky outcrop and vanished from sight. And at first, Pronin dismissed the encounter as a trick of light or fatigue, a rational response ingrained in men trained for aerial combat and battlefield decision-making. Yet 3 days later, he saw the same figure in the same location, clearly outlined against the winter sky, forcing him to confront the reality that his earlier observation had not been an illusion. And shortly afterward, one of his team's inflatable boats disappeared from camp without explanation, later found upstream against the current, an event locals attributed to the Alma, whom they blamed for stealing tools, food, and household items and carrying them into the mountains. And such stories, once dismissed as superstition, gained weight as similar reports accumulated from soldiers, scientists, and villagers across Soviet-controlled regions, prompting a series of officially sanctioned, but quietly, conducted expeditions aimed at documenting the phenomenon. And although no Alma was ever captured, researchers gathered footprints, hair samples, and a remarkable number of consistent eyewitness testimonies describing a large, upright, hair-covered hominid that avoided direct contact and retreated quickly when approached. And among those most invested in these findings was Soviet scientist Dr. Boris Porshnev, who undertook an exhaustive comparative study of Alma and Yeti reports, assembling what later scholars would describe as an impressive body of evidence. And Porshnev proposed a theory that would earn him ridicule among his peers, suggesting that the Alma and the Yeti were surviving populations of Neanderthals or a closely related hominid species that had retreated into extreme environments to escape extinction during prehistoric competition with Homo sapiens. And while this idea clashed with mainstream evolutionary models, it resonated with several Western researchers, including British anthropologist Dr. Myra Shackley, who noted that regions associated with Alma and Yeti sightings were rich in Neanderthal artifacts. And she argued that if any relict hominid population had survived in modern times, it would have done so in precisely these isolated, politically unstable, and environmentally hostile regions. And as Cold War tensions deepened, funding and institutional support for such research declined, not because the evidence disappeared, but because the subject itself became inconvenient. And so the Alma, like the Yeti, faded from official discourse, retreating once more into the margins of science and history, leaving behind a troubling implication that humanity's evolutionary wars may not have ended in total victory, but in uneasy separation. As the decades passed and global attention shifted away from unexplained encounters toward rapid technological progress and modern warfare, the mystery of the Yeti slowly faded from mainstream discussion, not because evidence ceased to appear, but because the world grew less willing to confront possibilities that challenged humanity's sense of dominance. And it was this long silence that made the Indian Army's 2019 discovery so significant, because when trained soldiers once again reported massive humanoid footprints in one of the most militarized and closely monitored mountain regions on Earth, it forced an uncomfortable realization that despite satellites, drones, and surveillance systems, vast stretches of the planet remain beyond our control and perhaps beyond our understanding. And as images of the tracks circulated online, laughter and ridicule followed predictably, echoing the dismissive reactions that had met earlier reports from British officers, Soviet scientists, and wartime explorers. Yet this pattern of mockery ignored a crucial detail: that the individuals making these claims were not thrill seekers or storytellers, but disciplined professionals whose lives depended on accurate observation. And when such men across different nations, eras, and conflicts consistently described the same type of being, upright, powerful, hair-covered, intelligent, and elusive, the possibility emerged that humanity was not dealing with a legend, but with a species that had survived by learning to avoid us. And this idea reframed the entire mystery, suggesting that the Yeti's continued elusiveness was not accidental, but intentional. Because if such a creature possessed intelligence comparable to early humans, it would also possess memory, pattern recognition, and the ability to learn from centuries of violent encounters with our kind. And history shows that when humans encounter what they do not understand, the response is rarely peaceful, as evidenced by the extinction of countless species and even close evolutionary relatives like the Neanderthals, who vanished not necessarily due to weakness, but because they could not compete with Homo sapiens for territory and resources. And if the Yeti or Alma represented a surviving branch of that ancient lineage, then retreat, secrecy, and avoidance would be its most effective survival strategy. And this theory also explained why physical evidence remained scarce, because an intelligent species might deliberately hide its dead, practice ritual disposal, or inhabit regions where remains decompose rapidly or are destroyed by environmental forces, making discovery extraordinarily difficult. And when combined with the sheer scale and hostility of the Himalayan and Central Asian mountain ranges, it became clear that absence of proof did not equal proof of absence. And there was also the uncomfortable comparison to humanity itself. A species willing to risk death to conquer peaks, wage wars in frozen wastelands, and leave behind the brightly colored remains of climbers frozen where they fell, monuments not to exploration but to obsession. And from that perspective, the Yeti's decision to remain unseen appeared not primitive but wise, because what intelligent being would willingly reveal itself to a species that hunts, captures, dissects, and exploits everything it encounters? And perhaps this was the true reason the Yeti appeared most often during times of conflict, when human activity pushed deeper into remote territories, disturbing ancient boundaries and forcing brief, reluctant encounters. And as the Indian Army's discovery reminded the world, the mountains are not empty. They are merely quiet, and in that silence may exist watchers who have observed every empire rise and fall, every war fought and forgotten, and who understand that survival does not require recognition, only patience. And so the final question is not whether the Yeti exists, but whether humanity is prepared for the consequences of proving it does. Because if one day a soldier or explorer comes face to face with this being in the fog and ice of high altitude, belief will no longer matter, ridicule will no longer matter, and the only question left will be the same one soldiers have always faced in unknown territory. Will the encounter end in understanding? Or will it become yet another chapter in a war we never knew we were fighting?